Imagine being the first to step into a home where the silence is so heavy, it feels like it's pressing down on your chest. Where every creak of the floorboards sounds like a scream. Where the air smells wrong, metallic, like rust, but sharper, thicker. Now imagine you're a seasoned officer, someone who's seen it all. Brutal crimes, tragic accidents, the very worst of humanity. But on this day, the moment you cross that threshold, your knees buckle, your breath catches in your throat, and for the first time in your career, you cry. You cry because what's inside that house is so disturbing, so twisted, that even your most hardened instincts can't shield you. This isn't a movie, and it's not some exaggerated urban legend. This happened. And what those officers found inside that suburban home would haunt them forever. You clicked on this video because you wanted to know what scene was so horrifying it broke trained professionals, men and women who deal with death and destruction for a living. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why they couldn't hold it together. But before we get there, I want you to imagine something. What if the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, but what you feel the moment you step into a room? What if your body knows something your brain hasn't yet figured out? That primal instinct, that sixth sense, that's what our officers experienced. And once the truth unraveled, that feeling turned into an unbearable weight of guilt, sorrow, and pure disbelief. Let me be clear, this story is not just about gore or shock. It's about something much deeper. It's about how one single call, a routine welfare check in a quiet neighborhood, spiraled into a real-life horror movie. It's about the fragile line between normalcy and madness. It's about the emotional toll this job takes on those who wear the badge. And most of all, it's about why what they saw inside that house remains one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American law enforcement history. You might think you're ready. You might even tell yourself you've seen worse in true crime documentaries or read about it in Reddit threads. But this scene is different. Because it didn't just leave a physical mess. It broke people. It shattered something inside them. Now, I want to speak directly to you. You're not just watching a video. You're walking into this house with them. You're about to relive their steps, feel their fear, and uncover the dark, twisted truth that lay hidden behind those suburban walls. This isn't just storytelling. This is an experience. And I'm asking you to stay with me until the very end. Because every minute, every detail in this story will bring you one step closer to understanding the full picture. You deserve the complete story, not just the viral headlines or the watered-down news reports. You came here for the truth, and that's exactly what you're going to get. No sugarcoating, no filters, just the raw, gut-wrenching truth of what happened that day. As we dive into this case, I'll introduce you to the officers who responded, the family at the center of it all, and the strange, unsettling clues that slowly peeled back layers of darkness no one was prepared for. You'll learn about the bizarre 911 call that first raised suspicions, the eerie behavior of neighbors who sensed something was wrong but couldn't put their finger on it, and the chilling discovery that made even the most seasoned crime scene techs avert their eyes. I'll walk you through every step, from the first knock on the door to the moment officers realized this wasn't just a crime scene. It was something else entirely. Something evil. And through it all, we'll ask the question, what drives a person to commit an act so depraved, so unimaginable, that it leaves a permanent scar on everyone who sees it? So buckle up, because things are about to get dark. You're going to meet people who wish they could unsee what they saw. You're going to hear truths that never made it to mainstream media. And you're going to find out exactly why this crime scene has been called one of the most disturbing ever encountered on U.S. soil. But just as we begin to unravel the first layer of this haunting mystery, just as the officers step into the house and the full horror starts to take shape, one of them suddenly turns back to the front yard, pale as a ghost, eyes wide with something between terror and realization. And what he says next changes everything. And that's where we begin. The officer who stumbled back onto the lawn, his name is Officer Marcus Hill. A 12-year veteran of the force, father of 3, calm in a crisis, and respected by his peers. He wasn't new to seeing dead bodies or walking into homes where things had clearly gone terribly wrong. But this time, something got under his skin, something deeper than what the eye could catch. When his partner, Officer Denise Monroe, asked him what was wrong. All he could manage to say was, "It's not just death in there. It's something else, something wrong." His voice cracked on the last word, as if even trying to explain it out loud made it more real. And that's when they called for backup, crime scene unit, forensics, psychological support, because they knew this was no ordinary welfare check. This was something that would leave scars, not just blood stains. Just hours earlier, the house had been quiet, the blinds were drawn, the mail was piling up, and the neighbors had begun to whisper. It was Mrs. Cunningham, the elderly widow from 3 doors down, who first voiced her concerns to the HOA president. She hadn't seen anyone leave the house in days. No lights on at night. No sound. Not even the family's dog barking. But what really made her nervous was what she did hear, a low, static-like hum coming from inside, almost like an old TV left on with no signal. She said it made her feel like someone was watching her from inside, even though no one ever answered the door. That's what prompted the wellness check that would uncover one of the darkest domestic crime scenes in recent memory. The family who lived there, James and Valerie Beckett and their 2 kids, had moved into the neighborhood just 6 months earlier. From the outside, they looked picture perfect. James was an IT consultant, worked from home most days. Valerie taught music at the local elementary school. Their son, Aiden, was in middle school, and their daughter, Chloe, had just turned 6. Photos from school events and Facebook timelines showed smiles, backyard barbecues, a Halloween costume contest. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that's what always makes stories like this even more disturbing, when there are no clear warning signs. No red flags. Just an ordinary American family living in an ordinary American home, until suddenly they weren't. Digging deeper into the days leading up to the discovery, investigators uncovered subtle clues that painted a much more complicated picture. James had recently taken a leave of absence from work. His emails became erratic. Misspelled words. Half-finished sentences. Then he stopped responding entirely. Valerie had also missed 2 school days in a row, without notifying anyone. Something that, according to her colleagues, she never did. She was known for her reliability, for always showing up, even when she was sick. A neighbor remembered seeing Valerie 2 nights before the discovery, standing motionless in the backyard long after dark, staring up at the trees. When he called out to her, she didn't respond. During a routine art class, the 6-year-old had drawn a picture that gave her teacher pause. It showed her family standing in front of their house. But there was something strange about it. All their faces were scribbled out, replaced with black smudges. And standing behind them was a tall, faceless figure in red. When asked who it was, Chloe simply said, "He's the reason we don't sleep anymore." The teacher made a note of it but didn't act on it. After all, kids draw weird things all the time. Only later would she realize how deeply disturbing that drawing truly was. The deeper authorities looked, the stranger things became. The security cameras around the Beckett property had been disabled days before the welfare check. Inside, every mirror in the house had been covered or shattered. Family photos were torn or flipped around to face the wall. And in the corner of the living room, scribbled across the wallpaper in red crayon, was a phrase repeated over and over again. "He's almost here." It was clear something had unhinged this family, but what and how remained the central mystery. Then came the red herrings. One neighbor, Doug Rains, a retired Army medic with a history of PTSD and some recent confrontations with the Becketts over property lines, was brought in for questioning. He'd been caught on a Ring camera just a week before, pacing up and down the sidewalk in front of their house, muttering to himself. When asked about the Becketts, he claimed they had opened something they shouldn't have and warned officers not to go inside. "You'll bring it out with you," he reportedly said. "You think it's a crime scene, but it's a trap." It was easy to write him off as unstable. But as details of the case emerged, his warnings began to feel less like the ramblings of a disturbed man and more like chilling prophecy. Even Valerie's estranged sister, Monica, came under scrutiny. She hadn't spoken to Valerie in over a year, after a falling out that neither of them ever discussed publicly. But in the days following the discovery, Monica came forward with something shocking. Months before, Valerie had called her in the middle of the night, sobbing, saying she was seeing things in the house. Dark shadows. Whispers from the vents. "I don't think the house wants us here," she had said. Monica dismissed it at the time, thinking her sister was just under stress. But now, those words echoed with terrifying clarity. None of the suspects made sense, and yet none of them could be ruled out. Was it a domestic violence situation spiraled out of control? Was someone from outside the family involved? Or was there something else at play, something that didn't fit into neat categories of motive and means? The crime scene offered no clear answers. Only more questions. There was no sign of forced entry. No ransom notes. No blood spatter analysis that made logical sense. What officers did find were layers of increasingly bizarre clues. Melted candles arranged in strange patterns, diary entries filled with incoherent ramblings, and a child's toy recorder containing eerie nighttime whispers that no one could explain. And through it all, that same phrase kept appearing, carved into walls, scratched into furniture, repeated on loop in the background of the last voicemail James left for his boss. "He's almost here." As forensic teams tried to piece the timeline together, it became clear the tragedy didn't unfold in one night. Whatever happened inside that house had been building for weeks, slowly, methodically. And as we peel back another layer of this mystery, as we follow the trail of confusion and fear and unanswered cries for help, one thing becomes chillingly certain. Someone or something had taken hold of that family. And it didn't let go until it had devoured every last piece of them. But just when investigators think they've hit the peak of the horror, when they believe they've cataloged every terrifying detail, one final discovery changes everything. A sealed envelope hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Chloe's room. Inside, a single photograph. No timestamp. No explanation. Just a blurry image of the family, all sitting at the dinner table, with a fifth figure, one no one can identify, standing behind them, smiling. And that's when the case turns from horrific to truly impossible. Just when investigators believed they were closing in on some version of the truth, something happened that shattered what little structure they had left in this tangled mess. The envelope with the photograph, the eerie image of the fifth figure at the dinner table, vanished. Not during transit, not during processing. It was logged, cataloged, and entered into the evidence database. Then, overnight, gone. No sign of a break-in. No tampered locks. Just an empty evidence box where the single most disturbing piece of the puzzle had been stored. Security footage was pulled, but the feed from that specific room glitched out during the exact window of time when the envelope disappeared. A system error, they said. But to the officers already on edge, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like someone or something was making sure they didn't get too close to the answer. What made the situation even stranger was the arrival of a man claiming to be a federal consultant. No badge, no credentials that could be verified, yet somehow he had clearance to walk into the station, examine the case files, and order the team to pause their investigation. He identified himself only as Agent Keller. Tall, clean-cut, almost robotic in demeanor. He spoke in clipped, formal sentences, avoided eye contact, and offered no explanation for his involvement. When pressed for credentials, he simply said, "This case has crossed into federal interest. I suggest you stop looking." And just like that, he was gone. No trace, no record of any agency involvement. A total ghost. But the chill he left behind lingered long after he disappeared. Officer Monroe swore she saw him watching her from across the street later that night, but when she walked over, the spot was empty. Only a faint smell of sulfur hung in the air, like something had burned but left no smoke. As suspicion grew, so did the rifts within the department. Sergeant Langley, who had supported the investigation from the start, suddenly turned cold. He began shutting down leads, pulling officers off the case, and discouraging further discussion. When Monroe confronted him, asking why he was blocking them at every turn, he simply said, "Because some things aren't meant to be found." That night, Monroe received an anonymous text, "He's not who you think he is. Check the 2003 files." When she searched the archives, she found a report buried under years of dust, a cold case, unresolved, with a near-identical setup. Another family, another fifth figure. And Sergeant Langley, was one of the responding officers back then. He'd seen this before. He knew what it meant. And he'd been keeping that knowledge buried ever since. But what was even more shocking than the parallel case was the realization that someone inside the department had been leaking details to a private entity. Internal emails flagged communications between one of the tech analysts and an unknown third party using a masked IP. The messages were vague, coded even, but the intent was clear. Someone was feeding classified evidence to someone else, someone watching the case unfold from the shadows. Was it blackmail? Paranoia? Or something deeper, like the analyst had been compromised? Then came the break-in at Monroe's home. Nothing was stolen. That same day, Valerie's former neighbor, a quiet woman named Diane Kelter who had long been considered just a peripheral witness, received something chilling. A package with no return address. Inside, a recording, cassette tape, of all things, marked only with the number 2. On the tape was audio that made Monroe's skin crawl. A child's voice, whispering nursery rhymes in reverse. Distant footsteps. And then, in the final 30 seconds, a man's distorted voice repeating the words, "You know what happens when they open the door. Now you hear it too." Diane, who had no history of mental health issues, was hospitalized that night after suffering what doctors called an induced auditory hallucination episode. She was found curled in her bathtub, rocking back and forth, her nails torn from clawing at the tiles. The last word she mumbled before blacking out, "He never had a face. He never had a face." What made matters worse was a new piece of evidence uncovered by the crime scene cleanup team that had been dispatched after the Beckett home was released back to the city. A wall panel in the basement, previously thought to be part of the foundation, was found to be hollow. Behind it, hidden in the darkness, was a room that hadn't appeared on any blueprints. Small, soundproofed, padded with aging insulation. Inside were dozens of photographs pinned to the walls, some of the Beckett family, others of people no one could identify. But every photo had the same figure crudely scratched out in red ink. Tall, faceless, always watching from the edge of the frame. What stunned investigators even more was a single Polaroid at the center of the wall, an image of Officer Hill, the partner who had just vanished. Taken from a distance, standing beside his cruiser, clearly unaware he was being photographed. And that's when the case fractured into something more than just psychological horror. It became a manhunt layered with paranoia, betrayal, and the growing fear that nothing could be trusted. Not people, not memory, not even evidence. Monroe began to question if the Beckett tragedy was just the epicenter of something much larger. What if they weren't the first family to be targeted, but simply the first to leave behind enough clues for someone to start noticing the pattern? But then the contradictions started surfacing. For weeks, everyone believed Valerie had stopped working 6 months before the incident, citing stress. But her HR records were altered. An anonymous whistleblower from her office submitted an encrypted message to local police, revealing that Valerie had in fact requested a leave of absence to protect her children from something following her home. That phrase echoed eerily with something Chloe's kindergarten teacher had written in a now-overlooked school incident report. Chloe had once said, "We're not allowed to talk about the man with no mouth. Mommy said we have to ignore him and he'll go away." Yet what made Monroe's blood run cold was what came next. A traffic cam, just a random roadside camera used for speed monitoring, captured footage of Valerie, just 2 days before the murders, walking down a street in another town. She wasn't alone. She was holding the hand of a young boy who couldn't have been her son. And behind them, almost blending into the shadows, was the unmistakable silhouette of the faceless man in red. The timestamp matched the exact moment that Valerie was supposedly logged into her office's internal system, miles away. How could she be in 2 places at once?
And who was the boy?
This revelation shattered the timeline they thought they had. And with every piece of evidence they uncovered, something else seemed to unravel. Sergeant Langley, now under internal investigation, remained evasive. But Monroe noticed him slipping, a tremor in his hand, a glance over his shoulder, the way he hesitated before entering dark rooms. When she finally confronted him again, his words were fragmented, fearful. "You think this is about murder? This isn't about murder. This is about invitations. They open something. It doesn't close. And it's watching all of us now." Then came the most gut-wrenching twist yet. A letter arrived at the precinct, addressed to Monroe. No stamp, hand-delivered. Inside was a photo of Chloe, recent. She was standing in what looked like a motel hallway, holding a stuffed animal. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. On the back of the photo was a message in block letters. "She's still alive. Stop looking or she won't be for long." Now, everything Monroe thought she knew had been upended. Was Chloe truly dead? Had the entire scene been staged? And if someone had gone to such great lengths to manipulate the evidence, then who was orchestrating this entire nightmare? And just when she thought it couldn't go any deeper, her phone buzzed with a video message. No number, just a file. When she opened it, her heart stopped. It was security footage, grainy, low-res, from the precinct's own hallway. Filmed the night before. It showed Monroe herself, sleepwalking, entering the evidence room, and standing in front of the now-missing envelope. But what chilled her to the core was what she did next. She turned, looked directly into the security camera, and smiled. Except she had no memory of doing it. Now, the mystery isn't just what happened to the Becketts. The real question is, who's really in control? Monroe barely slept after watching the footage. She had stared at the screen for hours, rewinding, playing it again, trying to convince herself that maybe it was doctored. Maybe it wasn't her. But there was no denying it. Not the way she walked, not the slight limp in her left knee from the old academy injury, not the unique ring on her middle finger, not the exact tilt of her head when she smirked into the camera lens. It was her. And that look, that eerie, knowing smile, it wasn't the expression of a woman in control. It was something else entirely. Something chilling. The kind of expression people make when they're not alone in their own mind. Monroe had seen it before, on those who had lived through trauma so severe it rewired them. Now, somehow it was her. She tried to keep moving forward, acting like things were under control, but every shadow seemed to shift just as she passed it. Every reflective surface felt like it was watching her, not reflecting her. Her phone started doing strange things too, contacts vanishing and reappearing, texts showing up and disappearing before she could read them, phantom calls from numbers that left no record. Then, one night while reviewing notes at her kitchen table, her apartment lights flickered and cut out. In the silence that followed, she heard a soft scraping sound, like nails on wood, coming from the closet down the hall. When she opened it, nothing was there, but her cat, Max, was gone. No fur, no blood, no sign of struggle, just an empty, silent space. And Max never left her side. The next morning, she drove to visit her sister, Beth, in the nearby town of Riverton, a trip she hadn't made in months. Beth had always been her anchor, the one person who could look at her and instantly know if something was wrong. But when she pulled up to the house, the driveway was empty. No mail in the box, no trash cans on the curb. Beth didn't answer the door. Neighbors said they hadn't seen her in days. Monroe used her spare key and let herself in. Everything inside was spotless, too clean, like it had just been staged. But in this photo, a third figure stood just behind them, blurry, faceless, wearing something read YouTube search. ChatGPT said. The night after the broadcast of her own voice through the static, Monroe didn't sleep at all. On the fridge, where family photos used to be, was a single photograph pinned in the center. It was one Monroe had never seen before, of her and Beth as kids, standing at the edge of a forest during a family camping trip. She wandered the apartment like a ghost trapped inside its own mind, every creak of the floorboards making her pulse spike, every shadow stretching just a little too far across the room. She knew she had to do something, anything, to get ahead of whatever this was. So she did the one thing she'd avoided up until now. She called her old mentor, Detective Raymond Ellison. Retired for 5 years, Ellison was known for solving some of the most baffling cases the department had ever seen. He wasn't just good, he was legendary. He had trained Monroe personally, sharpened her instincts, taught her how to read the darkness, without letting it consume her. But when his familiar voice came through the line, hoarse and slower than she remembered, she noticed something else, something hiding behind his words, like fear or guilt. He agreed to meet, but not at his house. Instead, he gave her coordinates to an abandoned farm just outside the city, somewhere he said nobody listens in. Monroe arrived just before dusk, the sky smeared in streaks of burnt orange and blood red. The air felt wrong. Still. Too quiet. Ellison stepped out of a rusted-out truck, shoulders hunched, eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. He looked thinner, paler, like someone who hadn't felt peace in years. And what he told her changed everything. He didn't start with explanations. He started with a question. "Monroe," he asked, "do you remember what happened the night before your first official case?" She blinked. Of course she did. It was the night she'd found her mother dead, ruled a suicide. Pills. A note. An open bottle of gin. That trauma had fueled her career, her desire for justice. It was the moment that shaped her. But now, Ellison shook his head slowly, as if mourning the truth he was about to share. "That wasn't your mother, Monroe," he said quietly. "Your mother didn't die that night. She vanished. And the woman in that house, she was someone else. Someone made up to look like her. Someone they wanted you to find." Monroe's breath caught in her throat. She whispered, unable to process it. Ellison's eyes glistened. "A unit we shut down years ago. Off-book. Experimental behavioral control. A program buried so deep the brass didn't even know it existed. They were testing memory manipulation, identity disruption, using synthetic trauma to mold recruits for something bigger. You were one of their subjects. You were never supposed to remember. But you did. In pieces. That's why they're coming back now." Monroe staggered back, suddenly cold despite the humid air. Her whole life, every decision she'd made, every ache and scar, had been carefully sculpted, engineered, none of it real. And worse, if what Ellison said was true, then everyone she had trusted in the department might be part of it. Maybe not all knowingly. Maybe they were victims too. But that meant the case she thought she was solving, the crime scene that shattered the other officers, the whispers, the vanishing cat, the SUV with no driver, was never about catching a killer. It was about keeping her unstable, keeping her doubting everything she saw. Then Ellison did something that pushed the knife deeper. He pulled out an old leather folder and handed it to her. Inside were pages, medical files, surveillance reports, photos of her at different ages, but never with her own name listed. Each one was labeled with a code name, Echo 7. In one photo, dated just 3 weeks before her mother's suicide, she was standing in a room she didn't recognize, beside a woman who looked exactly like her. The caption read, "Subject Echo 7 with synthetic twin. Initial imprint stage." She wanted to throw up. She wanted to burn the entire file and pretend none of it existed. But she couldn't, because buried in the last page was a list of names, other Echo subjects. And one of them was Beth. That was when she remembered the photo on Beth's fridge, the blurred figure in red behind them during that old camping trip. She'd thought it was just a distortion. But now it looked staged. Planted. That figure was in other files too. Always on the periphery. Always watching. And Monroe realized with horror that this wasn't just about what had been done to her. It was still happening. As she looked up from the file, Monroe realized Ellison was no longer facing her. His eyes were locked on something behind her, wide with terror. He whispered just one word, "Run." But before she could even turn around, the sky lit up with a flash like lightning and a deafening sound cracked the air. When she opened her eyes again, Ellison was gone. No trace. Not even footprints. Only the file remained at her feet. And in the distance, on the edge of the woods, that figure in red, still blurry, still faceless, was standing there again. Closer this time. And in that moment, Monroe finally understood. She wasn't chasing a killer. She was trying to escape her creators. The hours after Ellison vanished were a blur of chaos and creeping dread. Monroe couldn't go home. Not after what she'd just learned and what she'd seen in the woods. She drove aimlessly through the city, headlights cutting through the darkness, unsure where to go or who to trust. The file burned like a live coal in her bag, every page another blow to the life she thought she'd built. She tried calling Beth, but it went straight to voicemail. When she called again, the number was suddenly disconnected. That sinking feeling turned into something deeper, something primal, a gnawing sense that time was running out, and whatever they were planning, it was already in motion. She needed answers, and there was only one person left who might have them. Captain Ryder. Her superior. Her mentor. A man who had stood beside her in every major case, who had comforted her when the weight of the job got too heavy. But now, she couldn't shake the image of his name listed at the bottom of one of those files. Not as a victim, no, he was labeled as handler, active. She met him at the precinct under the guise of needing advice, forcing herself to act calm, collected. Inside, she was screaming. Ryder welcomed her with a smile that felt just a little too forced, his handshake a second too firm. She watched him closely, every word he spoke, every glance he gave. He asked how she was doing after the warehouse incident. Too casually. She brought up Ellison. His face twitched, only for a second, but it was there. And then, the moment that shifted everything, Monroe slid the folder across his desk. Ryder didn't even flinch. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask where she got it. Instead, he simply said, "You weren't supposed to find that." That was the moment the walls closed in. Ryder leaned forward, voice low, deliberate. "You need to understand, Monroe. This wasn't about hurting you. It was about building you, making sure you could survive what's coming, what's already here." He slid a different folder toward her, sealed, newer. Her name stamped in red on the front. "You've been activated," he said. "And now you need to decide where your loyalty lies. With the program, or with the chaos." Inside the folder was an address.